Hi, everyone. Just a quick heads up, Lauren and Mick did just lose power, but they are connecting through their phone right now. So we may just begin 1 to 2 minutes later than expected, but I will make sure to keep communication open with everyone in the meantime. So just give us 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you so much. All right. I'm so happy to see Lauren and Mick have made it here safely. What a great day. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Brady. I use she, her, hers. I am the Director of Sexual and Interpersonal Violence Prevention at the State University of New York. I am really, really grateful and excited about today's session. Two really wonderful colleagues and friends of mine who will be presenting on some really wonderful content, but I will allow Gwen Kay, once I hand it over to her, to do the formal introduction, but just some housekeeping notes. This session will be recorded. There is closed captioning available. If you select the closed captioning at the bottom of the screen, that should be able to activate it. We are going to really be encouraging folks to use the question and answer portion to really engage with the speakers today. And we hope that you will share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag SUNY Spectrum hashtag or tag our SUNY's Got Your Back account, and also join our Workspace by Facebook group and connect with colleagues from across the United States and Canada who are actively involved in this work as well. So with that, I'm very excited to formally hand it over to Dr. Gwen Kay.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I am Gwen Kay. I am she, her, hers. I'm a professor of history at SUNY Oswego, and I'm president of the University Faculty Senate, and I am thrilled to be here today. As a faculty member, particularly one who studies social history, the interactions of everyday people and ordinary people, and women's history, I am aware that my students need to see themselves in the historical actors who populate our classes. Two, I know that being inclusive continues to evolve and become a bigger and more needed tent. Questions are being asked now, written about, thought about, that either weren't occurring to people when I was a student, or if they were in hush corners, not a lot of attention. Now these questions are part of the historical conversation, and they need to continue and they need to get bigger. There is room to do better, to be better. I am thrilled, therefore, to welcome you to this session, A Pandemic and Political Uprising, Creating Inclusive and Anti-Racist Online Classrooms for Now and Beyond. This session focuses on best practices for creating inclusive and anti-racist curriculums and online classroom culture. By centering on the specific needs of Black students, Black LGBTQIA+ students, and Black student survivors, instructors will be better equipped to teach all students. Using an interdisciplinary lens, the presenters will discuss the importance of adaptability and urgency, highlight collaborative and accessible technologies and resources, and share a variety of techniques to create more equitable online resources. Today's speakers are Mick Powell Todd and Lauren Todd, and I will introduce them one at a time. Mick Powell Todd, she, her, hers, is an assistant professor in residence in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Connecticut. Mick Powell Todd is a queer Black feminist, poet, educator, and survivor. Mick earned her MFA in creative writing from Southern Connecticut State University in May 2018 after earning her BA in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. Mick's chapbook, Chronicle the Body, won Yamasee Journal's annual chapbook contest and was released in March 2019. Mick's poems and essays have been published or are forthcoming in Tinderbox Poetry, Frontier Poetry, Winter Tangerine, The Feminist Wire, Apogee Journal, and others. To learn more about her poetry, visit www.mickpowellpoet.com. Lauren Todd, she, her, hers, is the program coordinator and visiting instructor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Connecticut at Stanford. Lauren Todd is a queer woman, survivor, and educator who is currently an instructor in the University of Connecticut's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. Prior to teaching, Lauren was the LGBTQIA+ programming and education coordinator for Southern Connecticut State University's Sexuality and Gender Equality, or SAGE Center, and while there, earned her master's degree in Women and Gender Studies. Her master's thesis, Loving Interracially, Queer Manifestations, Representations, and Narratives of Invisibility, examines media representation and lived experiences of queer women, femfolk, in interracial relationships and how they experience sexism, queer antagonism, racism, and other forms of discrimination and violence. She earned her bachelor's degree in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Spanish from the University of Connecticut. And with that, I hand it over to our presenters.
Hi, everyone. I just, again, so many sincere apologies. We just lost power. I don't know how much everyone knows, but we did just lose power.
3 minutes right before we were going to go live.
And so we're a little frazzled, but we hope to sort of get back on the ball and do the presentation sort of as intended. But we do ask, and we're going to talk about the importance of being flexible. So we do ask that you extend us some grace as we're just sort of getting into this.
We're using my phone right now, so just bear with us. Is there a way we could see us?
I don't know.
Okay. So to go on a little bit about who we are, and thank you, Gwen, for that introduction. We're not breaking any social distancing guidelines. We are married, so that is why we're so close with no masks on. We got married about 2 years ago now, and lucky to both be at UConn. And being in different regional campuses, we're grateful to be under Women's Gender Sexuality Studies.
Yes, thank you. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you.
So before we officially begin, we wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. So with that, I will just read. With gratitude and respect, we recognize and acknowledge the land we live on is stolen land belonging to the Paugussett people. It is necessary to remember the painful history of forced removal of Native and Indigenous people from this territory, and to honor and respect the Indigenous peoples that were and still are connected to this land. And we recognize the reverberations of colonialism, past and present, and seek healing through this with this acknowledgement. Right now we are specifically located in Connecticut, in the lower Naugatuck Valley, just about 10 miles east or west of New Haven. When we speak of the Paugussett people, that is the area in which we are inhabiting right now.
Thank you. Next slide, please. And we wanted to, before we sort of jump in, we wanted to give everyone a moment to breathe. Here we are in the middle of the week, at the end of the day, of what's been a really fantastic conference, really informative and thought-provoking conference. during the pandemic. And so before we get started, and I think we might need this exercise too, we just wanted to invite you to take some deep breaths. And I will read this short poem by Danez Smith. And just to give you a little context, Danez Smith is a Black, queer, HIV positive poet and performer from St. Paul, I believe. And their poetry, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about their poetry later on, but their poetry has been so essential in sort of grounding me, particularly in this moment. So I wanted to open with Danez's poem, and it's titled Little Prayer. And again, I invite you all to take some deep breaths as we go through this. So Little Prayer by Danez Smith. Let ruin end here. Let him find honey where there once was a slaughter. Let him enter the lion's cage and find a field of lilacs. Let this be the healing, and if not, let it be. Deep breath and a deep breath out. Thank you. We can go on to the next slide.
So here we are last year in Spectrum at the Spectrum conference, and we just wanted to have some of that energy and kind of bring that in-person experience that we had last year into this digital space, and hope that maybe next year we can all be together again in person. So that is us, and if you remember seeing us, we maybe look a little bit different now. That is us then, and that is us now. So yes, we just wanted to kind of bring in the in-person and the digital and infuse that as much as possible during these weird times. And we wanted to go over the agenda for today. So, oops.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Why teach from an anti-racist perspective? Oh. Sorry about that. Sorry, I'm so sorry. This is so embarrassing.
Not how we planned.
So sorry, to go on. The first half of the talk, we're going to focus on why use an anti-racist framework to do this work. We're going to talk a little bit more about ourselves and why we've decided to do this work, what's led us to this point. And then again, thinking about how to apply an anti-racist framework and make your classrooms more inclusive. And then for the second part, we're going to give you some tips and tools that we've been using or that we know folks have been using in their classes that have produced some really positive results with students. And then at the end, we're going to open it up for Q&A for questions that y'all might have for us. Thank you. Next slide. So again, the first part is going to focus on the importance of anti-racist and inclusive training. What you'll notice throughout is that we've used some of our favorite posts from Instagram, and we're going to talk about the usage and the sort of embedding of Instagram into your classes. And so we've included that in our slideshow here so that you can see how we're kind of doing that even with our students. So what we have on this slide is a post from the Unapologetic Street series. That's their account on Instagram at the Unapologetic Street series. And this is a digital drawing which reads, "When I say Black Lives Matter, that includes queer Black lives too." We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means and what that looks like for us. But again, I just want to give you all the context and get you ready for our conversation about Instagram. Thank you.
So one of the most important questions that comes up in meeting is, why do we do this work? Why do we want to present on this? And we are not experts, of course, on teaching during a pandemic. Just like all of you, when COVID-19 hit, in our area, at least mid-March, and things were shutting down, we were forced to shift our pedagogy and shift it very fast. and to adapt, some new and some, different techniques that we were maybe not used to. And so this is only, not even 6 months that we've been really thinking about, virtual spaces and online learning, that as being one of the only ways to have educational experiences. Coming up in the fall, we'll both be teaching online. So, thinking about how this can be something that we do, whether we're virtual or in person. And we are pretty young instructors. We've only been teaching for just a few years in women's gender sexuality studies and just in general. So we don't have decades of pedagogy under our belt. So we are, learning and growing, just like many of you, especially in this unique situation we're all in. And being marginalized students once ourselves, I'm a queer woman, Mick is Black and a Black queer woman. We are really trying to envision the classes that we always wanted for ourselves, and that center folks like us. And yeah, we've been using a lot of our evaluations to inform our future classes, and having a lot of conversations with students, and asking students, what's working, what's not, and just being, flexible and adaptable as we go.
Yeah, and open to receiving feedback from students, from our colleagues, in order to make our classes, again, as anti-racist and inclusive as possible. Thank you. So we know, again, when thinking about why do we do this work, and also bridging the gap as why should you do this work, we're thinking about all of the things that existed pre-COVID-19 and also post-COVID-19, and also coexist, right, with the pandemic that we're living through. We know that the pandemic has compounded the strenuous economic and health hurdles faced by queer and trans people of color sort of across the board. We know that trans women of color are 6 times more likely to experience physical violence from police officers when interacting with them compared to white folks and white cis folks. We know, based on a couple of different surveys that have gone out, in our own personal interactions, sort of anecdotally from our students and our queer and trans students of color, we know that they are reporting increased feelings of depression and anxiety, increased levels of stress as a result of both the pandemic and the lack of access to school services that they would typically get on the college campus. We also know that overall and in general and across the span of time, that crisis situations have an intense impact on survivors of various forms of violence, particularly sexual violence. And we know that impact is often compounded for folks who have various marginalized identities. And so when we're considering that, right, if we're thinking about, again, pre-COVID-19, right, none of that stuff, none of the things I've mentioned have went away, have disappeared. So in fact, the pandemic, again, has just sort of been added to those pre-existing stresses or those pre-existing conditions. So we're thinking about how the pandemic is layered on top of those, rather than seeing these struggles or these situations as separate. Thank you.
So on the left, on our left, we have another like photo or infographic rather from Instagram that we like, that speaks to a lot of what Mick was just talking about. Then this is quoted from Dr. Marcela Nunez-Smith out of Yale, saying, "We know that these racial ethnic disparities in COVID-19 are the result of pre-pandemic realities. It's a legacy of structural discrimination that has limited access to health and wealth for people of color." And all the things listed underneath that, like some of the systemic racist biggest issues that are, hitting Black and Latinx and Indigenous communities now with coronavirus were happening, of course, before coronavirus. And so what was working before actually wasn't working, and what we're doing and what has been happening now still isn't working, for these communities, and these communities are our students. Today we're trying to really envision what this looks like for BIPOC and Black, Indigenous, people of color, and those that are LGBTQ, and envisioning, classes and courses where they can thrive, and that are those student-centered.
Yeah. And as we sort of touched on this in the last slide, but what we have on the right side for us is that thinking about how last year, again, as it says in the quote, long before COVID-19 was in our purview and had obviously impacted our lives in the way that it has, the AMA describes the violence against trans people as an epidemic in the United States, right? And the victims, the folks who are most impacted by this are Black trans women. And so we know that there are Black trans women in our classes. So what does it look like? And we have to think and we have to imagine, particularly for those who are cis, particularly for folks who are straight, who are not Black, even if you're another person of color, right? What does it mean? What does it mean to be surviving an epidemic of violence alongside a medical and health pandemic? And so if we know that we have Black trans students in our class, if we can imagine that we might have Black trans students in the future, right, we need to create a class, like Lauren said, where they can thrive. And being mindful of that is creating a safer and better class for Black trans women, right? In particular, thinking of that group of folks in particular makes a better class for everyone.
Yeah, and I would just like to note too that Black trans students, are often still thriving with all these conditions, but it's so much harder, for them, with an epidemic of trans violence and COVID-19 and police brutality and other forms of violences. They're still thriving, but it shouldn't be, this hard and this difficult and this challenging. So trying to create our classes so that that's just one way that it's more accessible for them to thrive, and it doesn't have to be another hurdle.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point.
So this just speaks to the intersections of Black folks and LGBTQ folks as an issue that is one and the same. And so we call in Audre Lorde, who's a Black feminist scholar. She had cancer. She is a librarian. She is a poet. She is a mother. She is many wonderful things. And we use her often in our women's gender sexuality studies class. So we call her into this space. And I'll quickly read this quote, that any attack against Black people is a lesbian and gay issue because I and thousands of other Black women are part of the lesbian community. And any attack against lesbian and gays is a Black issue because thousands of lesbians and gay men are Black. There is no hierarchy of oppression. So just, looking at this, that, our Black students, our LGBTQ students, obviously not all, and our LGBTQ students are Black and brown students. So thinking that, we have to be tackling all of this all at once and not as separate issues.
So before we go any further, we want to just talk a little bit about the meaning of anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness, as opposed to just simply stating racism, really thinks about the ways in which racism, particularly in the United States and across the world, is anti-Black primarily, right? Or that there is a form of anti-Black racism that impacts everyone, but particularly impacts Black people. And so we know, throughout particularly these past few months, there's been these conversations about what overt anti-Blackness looks like and what covert anti-Blackness looks like. And so some examples of overt anti-Blackness that is public and easily identifiable, some examples include lynching, right? And under lynching also, we talk about police brutality in a little bit, so we would include that. under lynching. Obvious hate crimes, right? Crimes that are very direct and targeted, and that we can very easily pin as racially motivated. When we think of white supremacy groups, we think of white supremacy groups as overt displays or organizations that are overt in their anti-Blackness. We also, of course, think of racial slurs. That's an easily identifiable form of racism or anti-Blackness, right? And then we have covert, which I don't think that these two things are ever separate, or that one. I just don't think that they're separate. But when we think of ways that anti-Blackness might be more covert, more sort of hidden or less easily identifiable, we think of some forms are white silence, right? Refusing to speak up about anti-Blackness in spaces where you have the privilege to do so. Anti-Blackness can also be color blindness, openly refusing to acknowledge that like people are Black, right? Or that people of color exist, right? Saying you don't see color means that you don't understand that people of color exist. This can look like cultural appropriation. This can look like invalidating Black folks' experiences, right? Not believing Black folks when they talk about anti-Blackness and the violence that Black people have faced for centuries, and that they're facing today, right? Invalidating those experiences is often read as covert, again, under the rug, not easily identifiable as, say, as a white supremacy group.
Yeah, I would just like to,
It's okay.
I would just like to add that I think there's a lot of folks that sometimes think that we're in a period of like covert anti-Blackness, which is very much like untrue. Of course, that's very much right now, but we also are in and we have been for this whole time, since slavery, we are still in this period of over anti-Blackness. And as Mick was saying, there are lynchings happening, every single day, whether that's in the form of police brutality or actual lynchings. Those are still happening across the United States. And there are hate crimes, and the KKK is still alive and well. They have not been targeted by the FBI ever. So we're still very much in a period of overt anti-Blackness. So thinking about that those are our students, our colleagues that are experiencing not only covert anti-Blackness, which sometimes feels like what there might be, which sometimes people might think that that's what they're experiencing in the institution, and while at college, but they're very much experiencing over anti-Blackness, maybe hopefully not in the classroom, but in our college spaces. Yeah.
So anti-Blackness shows up everywhere, and we just wanted, for the purposes of the presentation, talk about what does it look like in our curriculum and in our classrooms. So the first thing, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we're thinking about tips and tools, but in our curriculum, it looks like just not refusing to acknowledge the movement for Black lives and what it looks like in the current moment, right? I think something that we've always been committed to, and even more so now, is just acknowledging that reality exists outside of this classroom, right? And so it's irresponsible, I think, for us as instructors to not acknowledge what is happening, right? Whether that's the pandemic or the current movement for Black lives. In our curriculum, that can look like lack of or incorrect information about Black history, lack of Black scholars, thinkers, writers, and artists included in the curriculum, having narrow or exclusive categories of scholarship, what is scholarship and what is not, what is academic and what is not, and refusing to sort of ever cross those boundaries or those borders that are socially and sort of academically, intellectually constructed, which invalidates and completely ignores other forms of knowledge production, right? And what I mean by that, I don't mean to be too sort of like jargony, but what I mean by that is just literature looks like this, right? And feeling like these are the qualifications for literature. And anything that falls outside of that is not literature, right? Refusing to open that up completely excludes so many different folks who are producing knowledge, experiential knowledge, intellectual knowledge, right? Just as valid scholarship in other ways. So yeah, that's that point. And then also, and we'll see this across the board, just having rigid standards that don't acknowledge, again, the reality of the world can be very isolating and, again, invalidating for students who are experiencing, again, overt anti-Blackness, covert anti-Blackness, anti-trans violence, right? Who are experiencing all of these things. If there's no space in your course, in your curriculum, for those students to at least identify with that and at least be able to express how it's impacting them, and no sort of flexibility, that's problematic for a lot of students. And we know that across the board when we look at how students are performing in particular spaces, depending on the rigidness of the standards. In the classroom, that can look like when we were in person, or even as you're creating your courses now, if you choose to use any sort of any of the what's the word I'm looking for? Any of the sources or materials, or resources that we share today, being transparent about the content that's in them. I think Anti-Blackness looks like going into classroom and showing a historical documentary about Black folks and never acknowledging beforehand that people will see photographs of lynchings, right? That's happened to me so many times across so many classes. And if I had just had a moment's notice that this is the content that's going to be shared with you, I think I would have been able to navigate it a little better. And I know there's lots of conversation around content warnings, but I think that in this particular moment, it's important for us to just, again, you don't have to spoil the story, but I think it's important for us to just know what we're going to be engaging with. In the classroom, it can look like an invalidation of Black students' intelligence or achievements or curiosities. So many students share stories about being told that they've plagiarized, that there's no way that they could have written the essays that they've written for no other reason that they can discern except for their race, their gender, their sexuality, their survivor status, whatever that looks like for them. And so that is anti-Black, of course. And with that particular example around the plagiarism, there are lots of students who have shared that classmates have maybe plagiarized actually, or done things that were just as sort of academically egregious, and that there's an equitable demonstration of patience and flexibility for students who are not Black. Again, colorblind, as if people of color don't exist, teaching in that way can be anti-Black. Using anti-Black language in the class is anti-Black. And a refusal to name or call out anti-Black language or behavior in the classroom, in your faculty meetings and other spaces is anti-Black. And so we are also interested in thinking about, again, with the intersections, how does homo and trans antagonism show up in classrooms and our curriculum, and how do anti-survivor sentiments show up in our virtual college classrooms and curriculums? And in a lot of these ways, they're very similar to anti-Blackness, so I didn't sort of reproduce all of them here, but specifically for queer and trans students, again, acknowledging the violence that exists in the content that you're sharing. We're going to talk about sharing content. We think it's important that you share content, but at least giving, a reasonable content warning for what exists therein. Also being unwilling or having a lack of understanding of the interactions or the intersections of police violence and the policing of queer and trans communities, particularly queer and trans communities of color. Not recognizing the history of police brutality against queer and trans folks of color, and seeing those things as separate, right? That invalidates folks' experiences and it erases history. Of course, we know, I think most folks know that using folks' incorrect pronouns or dead naming or using the incorrect name for a student is a form of trans antagonism and trans violence. And also just to repeat, rigid standards that don't account for the real world. And again, similar for survivors in the classroom, the lack of content warnings can be harmful. The lack of understanding how survivors, the history between survivors and police forces, right, refusing to acknowledge that intersection is a form of erasure. And then again, the rigid standards that don't, again, account for reality that our students are living through.
Also too, we specifically use like the terms like homo or queer and trans antagonism instead of like homophobia, queerphobia, or transphobia, because right, phobias are, you know, real mental health issues, and nobody has a real mental health fear, a deep-rooted fear of queer and trans people. So we use the term antagonism. We're not the only ones, but folks use the term antagonism specifically. Not that, you know, saying homophobia, or queerphobia, or transphobia is necessarily wrong, but antagonism really, you know, takes the it's more like an antagonistic relationship more than a deep-rooted fear. And I would also just like to cite Hope Giselle from the session yesterday, who used the term trans-loathing. And I think that is a great way to, even instead of antagonism, using like a queer loathing and trans-loathing, you know, to describe that relationship that folks that do have queer, trans antagonism or loathing towards people in the LGBTQ community, that the trans loathing that Hope Giselle named yesterday was a great way, we both thought.
Yeah. I don't know if Hope is here, but thank you for that language. That was really something that stood with us long after the session. So why should you do this work? I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so why should you do this work? So, well, one thing is that, you know, we're surviving and dealing, some of us are surviving and dealing with COVID-19 right now, as well as, you know, dealing with the racist state and the always racist state of our country. So we're not separating these issues at all. You know, they're very much going on simultaneously. So we're really trying to think of making anti-racist and inclusive classrooms that are rooted in our reality right now. And that I think I mentioned this a little earlier, but really envisioning taking the best parts from the courses that we've taken and how instructors and professors centered us, but then also, you know, really listening to our students that are Black and Brown and LGBTQ, and what they want and need right now. Because, you know, when we were in undergrad and grad, that was, you know, years ago, and, you know, we weren't in a pandemic. So I'm really thinking about what that looks like right now at this moment.
Yeah, I think that, I'm sorry, just trying to read here. I think that anti-racism and inclusive classroom makes schools safer for all students. And we know that designing a safe classroom is sometimes impossible, but being intentional about using some of these practices make it that much more possible. And we know that these classes tend to garner significant student engagement. We know that students come out of these classes with a deeper knowledge of the subject. And we also know that this is what allyship in action looks like. This is particularly for folks who are, whether you're a white ally or a straight ally or a cis ally, like this is what that looks like. And I think, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, but I think that we want to be as broad as possible. We recognize that we teach in women's and gender and sexuality studies, and that this will look different for folks depending on what interdiscipline or transdiscipline or discipline that you're in. But using some of these tips again, this is what it means to sort of be an accomplice or an ally, if you are an educator. Overall, anti-racist and inclusive classrooms are better classrooms for everyone. So we're going to jump into part 2 now. And this is, again, our sort of tips and tools sections, things that we've used in our classes, things that have really worked well for our students. UConn is a PWI. Again, we teach in women's gender sexuality studies. So our experiences are what has worked for our students in our particular classes might look different. But we hope that y'all find some usefulness in here. And we wanted to open with this quote from James Baldwin. He writes and gives this talk to teachers in 1963. And I felt when I was revisiting it just a few days ago for this presentation, it resonated so much with me in this particular moment. And so Baldwin writes, "You must understand that in the attempt to correct so many generations of bad faith and cruelty, when it's operating not only in the classroom, but in society, you will meet the most fantastic, the most brutal, and the most determined resistance." I think it's important to hold that context as we move into this section of the talk, just because it's not always easy to do this work. And we want to acknowledge that. We feel very much supported by our colleagues in the WGSS program in terms of making our classes anti-racist and inclusive. We also feel supported in lots of different ways, and it's different everywhere, but there's the university itself is very open about its sort of the politics that it wants to present. And so we feel supported in that space too. So we recognize those sort of tensions might look different for other folks. And I think Baldwin is giving us some language to think about, like, you are going to meet some resistance, particularly depending on where you are and where you teach and the institutional culture at your school or university. And yeah, it's still important to do this work.
So something very easy and simple to do is to add Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Lives Matter to your syllabus or any materials, or to even add like a photo, like, since we're not meeting in person, we're meeting virtually, you may do an assignment where that's an infographic and there's a photo of yourself and some facts, or, there might be periods where you do an introductory session. So just making sure that, you're like what you want reflected in the classroom, since it is virtual, is very clear. So by putting, a photo or, Black Lives Matter, it's not meant to be, performative, but to really declare the space that, and to make clear to Black students and students that are allies for Black lives, that, this is going to, and this should be a space where that anti-Black violence or anti-Black language or anti-Black anything is not, going to be tolerated in the classroom. So this is, you could put this right next to your name, or on your syllabus, like however you design. You could be using. These are just quick ways to just signal to students that you're going to be an instructor that is hopefully gonna create a safe and inclusive class, and that Black students in particular can thrive in.
It's a very simple and cross-discipline way that you can incorporate this, I think, into your classes.
So something else is that obviously throughout the summer there have been a lot of protests, but they all haven't been necessarily specifically for George Floyd. And while there have been a lot of protests specifically for George Floyd, just saying the George Floyd protests and referring to the summer as the George Floyd protests is really erasing the histories of violence against Black people and the resistance against this violence, and erasing especially the violence against Black women, cis and trans, and Black queer people that often don't get the airtime, that don't get the recognition, and don't get really any notice at all. So we just wanted to highlight, with our time here today, three folks of many. There have been already over 700 police shootings since the start of the year. Mostly Black folks, and a lot of Black women, a lot of Black queer and Black trans folks, and of course a lot of Black cis men and trans men, and that doesn't erase the how horrible that is to them, but we just wanted to kind of highlight Tony Mcdade, who is a Black trans man, and he was violently killed in Tallahassee not too long ago. You might not have heard of him, but hopefully you have. Nina Pop, who was violently killed, not by the police, but in an interpersonal way. She was found dead, and that was in Missouri, and she was only 28. And Breonna Taylor, who, for one of the first times we're hearing a lot about a Black cis woman who was fatally shot, but I hope it's not the last that we're hearing more from. We're hearing more about the other victims of police brutality that aren't Black cis boys and men, because there's a lot of like I said, a lot of Black LGBTQIA folks and cis girls and women that are murdered too by the police.
Yeah, and we're thinking. And I think that referring to the protest as the George Floyd protest also, again, like Lauren mentioned, erases like the history of violence, right? George Floyd was killed in a horrific way, as was Tony Mcdade, as was Nina Pop, as was Breonna Taylor. And the protests, although George Floyd might be the face of this particular moment, there were protests years before George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and there will be protests after. And the protests that I am most moved by and humbled by are the ones that are making these sort of connections. And it's about the movement itself is about, right? Even if you look at the Black Lives Matter website and you read their mission statement, it's about liberation for all Black people. It's about thinking about the way violence impacts people in so many different ways. For those of us who survive, what does that look like, right? For those of us who don't survive, how do we honor those folks? And so it's beyond that. And so we did want to speak these folks' names into the space and honor their memory just a little bit here. And for folks who didn't know about these other stories or experiences, I encourage you, we both would encourage you, I think, to do the research and to stay informed about, there are lots of different like police trackers and things online, but just to stay informed about what's happening.
Something else that you could use is inclusive logos or art. These are just a few examples that UConn provides for faculty and staff to use, and we kind of we use them on our syllabus, and you can use them on different materials. But as faculty members, we don't when we were in person or not, you travel from classroom to classroom. It's not like through K through 12 when you have a classroom that stays your classroom. So we consider these like posters or stickers that we carry with us virtually. So we slab these on right on the front of our syllabus, again with the same reason for using Black Lives Matter is students that are LGBTQ will immediately identify this, and they will understand hopefully what kind of person you are, what kind of and the politics you follow in your classroom, and then also what kind of classroom and classroom standards you have, and that is hopefully, you know, not tolerating you know, queer and trans antagonism. And so yeah, so it signals to students that you're open and affirming, and this is a safer place for them than potentially another course. Maybe there's another professor that's teaching a similar class and they don't have this. Well, a student might actually, you know, choose your class. And then with UConn's logos, they use the Philly Pride flag from 2017, which specifically uses the brown and black stripes to make space for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities that have, you know, largely been pushed out of the queer and trans community. So, you know, so that's, you know, if your university doesn't have, you know, any logos at all, or it doesn't have one with the Philly Pride flag, you know, think about creating, you know, your own, or just grabbing off, you know, just a flag from, you know, the internet, but just, you know, any way to just show to your students that, you know, this is going to be a safer and affirming place for them.
Yeah, and again, similar to with the Black Lives Matter, Lauren had mentioned that, like including that on your syllabus. This is again, very small way that you can signal to students what kind of environment you would like to cultivate in your class.
Oh, I was just thinking, like, this is also great too. Like if you're teaching, you know, we teach WGSS, but if you're teaching math or biology and you may not be able to talk a lot about the things that, you know, we get to talk about in our class, these are just small ways, you know, if you're in a discipline that, you know, cannot talk about, again, these things, you can just, you know, have a logo, you can have Black Lives Matter, and you would still talk about math, but you still have a safe space for Black and LGBTQ folks.
So your syllabus, as you can tell based on what we've said so far, is a really critical, particularly in the time of virtual and distance learning, it's a really critical component of your course. And it could be your syllabus, but it also could be your course website or other ways that you communicate with your class. But in whichever way you choose to do that, these components are so critical because, again, students are not necessarily getting the in-person use. Students might not be visiting your office hours, where your office, again, has like the posters that you might keep to explain yourself in a different sort of way. So these documents become really critical. I think in your syllabus, and I think you can do this across disciplines as well, including a short glossary of inclusive and appropriate queer and trans terms, language that we use to talk about Black and Indigenous people of color, just for students to know. I think that there might be classes where that feels less in alignment with the curriculum, but I also think that we also have to, again, to be rooted in reality, we have to break what we know as our standard curriculum. And I think that this is, again, another small way that you can engage students. I think, again, across disciplines, you can assign short and informative and engaging audio and visual media. You can use pop culture. We're going to talk again about Instagram. You can use Instagram posts to engage students or to just share with students. And I think what's been useful for folks who I've talked to or who I know who are not in WGSS is for them to make those into extra credit assignments, or to make those into 4 credit assignments that maybe don't have as big of a percentage as something more maybe course related. But there are ways to embed these things in your classes that don't take away, right? They're not going to take away from the other content, particularly if you design it in a way that works for you. They're not going to take away from the other important course content. Yeah. And then, of course, and I think this is sort of standard practice at this time, but you should include on your syllabus just sort of standard information for students to know, and maybe campus and off-campus locations and resources for them. I think whenever our university or our program sends out any sort of statement on anti-racism, on the movement for Black lives, on COVID-19 and sort of the support systems in place, we try to share those with our students just so they have access to it. And then also what you can do with those is look at those with a critical eye. It's important to question why your university is sending these out and the language that they're using there. And then so they can get a better understanding of the university. And also just so they have the information. Of course, you should include information for like your offices of diversity and equity, your Title IX coordinator, any counseling and mental health services on campus, any cultural centers, like a women's center or a rainbow LGBTQIA plus center, multicultural centers or centers, right? Like for us, we call it the African American Cultural Center, the Puerto Rican Latino Cultural Center, any sort of centers that folks have access to on campus. And I would say, particularly in this time too, in the virtual world, if you come across any virtual webinars or events or resources that students might be interested in, it never hurts to just, again, throw those out there. They can become extra credit assignments, or students just might go because they're looking for more information or community or resources to understand what's happening now or their own experiences. So I think being willing to share what you find with students and maybe even not attaching it to an assignment for class is just a way that you demonstrate where you're at and your sort of politics, and then also give students the resources that they need to perhaps thrive or find what they need.
So something that is super important is to include and cite Black scholars and creators in your course. And we really hope that this doesn't come at the end of the semester and, not in week 12. But, you're doing this from the very beginning. And in our classes, we start with, Black history and film and art and activism. And obviously cater it to whatever our course is, but we're starting right with the most marginalized, and that you're really trying to challenge the myths and stereotypes regarding Blackness, queer and trans identities, survival and violence.
Yeah, I will talk more about this in the next couple of slides, so that's good. Yeah. So part of the push to cite Black folks and cite Black women in particular started in 2017, led by Dr. Kristen A. Smith. And she writes here, this is another sort of like infographic piece, but she writes here, in November 2017, I started the Cite Black Women campaign, a movement that engages with social media. We're going to come back to social media and aesthetic representation in order to push people to critically rethink the politics of knowledge production by engaging in a radical praxis of citation that acknowledges and honors Black women's transnational intellectual production, #CiteBlackWomen. And so as we're going through our courses and our curriculums, we're, like Lauren said, we're centering and focusing on those narratives. Again, perhaps for us in women's gender and sexuality studies, maybe a little bit sort of more natural, but the way that I've heard folks do this in other disciplines that again might seem a little more rigid or less flexible to incorporate some of these things is talking about historical figures or people in history who were Black and contributed to the field, who were queer or trans and contributed to the field. If for you and your class and your discipline, that's just not a part of the reality or the history of your discipline, which I find hard to believe. But if that is the case, I think interrogating why that is also a way that you can bring this into the classroom, right? Mm-hmm. If you're saying your discipline has no Black people in history, then why is that? Have students interrogate that.
Yeah, and doing your own sort of digging and research. And then to add to Mick's point is, it just, you should get in the habit of giving credit where credit is due. And, it's a really imperialist idea to just kind of like rob, you know, people's ideas and then just take them as your own. And especially when it comes to Black folks, whether they're Black and LGBTQIA, Black women that are cis, or any Black person, there's been a long history, like Mick was saying, that they've been not credited, you know, for their work and their thoughts and their labor. So this really shows that you value the Black labor and thoughts and work that went into, you know, creating something or their mark on history. And you should be doing this even when Black folks are not in shared space. If you have if you're white and your class is all white, you should still, of course, be doing this. It's not only for the Black people in the room, but it's for everybody in the room. And you know, your white students especially should know that and be hearing that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So two classes that Mick and I are teaching this coming up semester is I'm teaching an introductory course called Gender and Sexuality in Everyday Life. And I'm using Mickey Kendall's Hood Feminism that just came out in, I believe, like January 2020. It's notes from the movement, the notes from the women that a movement forgot. And I just wanted to quote her really quick as it speaks to a lot of the components of our talk today. Most people are talking about police brutality. Unfortunately, it is often framed solely as a racial issue, one that disproportionately impacts Black men, erasing its impact on young Black women or on those who are trans or genderqueer. We know fewer names of Black women, cis and trans, who have been victims of police brutality than we do any other group. There's little discussion about their risk of sexual assault, arrest, and even death. And, you know, more than any other group, Black women in particular, when they're experiencing police brutality, they're, you know, also often experiencing sexual violence, and Black women more than any other gender or racial group are experiencing really high rates of sexual violence and you know, physical violence when it comes to the police, and that's goes for Black women, cis or trans, like Kendall pointed out. So that's just an example of a text that I'm using, and Mick's using Invisible No More.
Yeah, so one of the classes that I'm teaching is Women, Gender, and Violence, and the way that I've taught the class historically has always been, of course, thinking about the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and all those sort of identities that make us into who we are. And then for this semester in particular, I've always used Richie's work, but I was drawn to assigning the textbook, Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. And it's a really formative and in-depth text that I would recommend reading, even if you can't assign it for your classes. I recommend reading to understand the legacies of violence against Black women and girls and women and girls of color, as well as what that looks like in the contemporary moment. Richie breaks the book down into sections that focus on Black girls and women with disabilities, Black girls and women who are sex workers, the policing of motherhood regarding Black women and girls and women and girls of color. She says right out on the first page that when I'm referring to women and girls, that is always inclusive of trans women and girls, period. And I think that this is one of the spaces, it's one of the only books I feel where I've actually seen that sort of laid out in that language on page 1. And it's a critical text for this particular moment. And I'm very, I guess if excited is a good word to use, but I'm excited to teach it to students or to learn from it with students this upcoming semester and for the future semesters.
So another course I'm teaching is Women, Gender, and Film. And as I mentioned earlier, the first 3 or 4 weeks focus on different genres within Black film. And these are just 4 films of many that I use that highlight, Black queer experiences and, the joys and the magic, as well as, the hardships and the violence. And that really speaks to centering students that are Black and LGBTQIA and survivors in different ways, because these are, authentic representation, more so authentic representations of folks' lives. Obviously, in the case of Bessie, that was, it's a biopic, so it's based on a real person, Bessie. And then in other ways, and the other films, they are, directed and produced and written by Black people, some of which are Black and queer. So that's really important that, you're looking, if you're creating a film class or using film in any way, that you're not only looking for, who's on the screen and, what's, who's starring in it and what the storyline's about, but who's, who are the folks behind the scene, who's creating and writing these stories. I'm making sure that those kind of match. And in these cases, we are seeing, Black folks both behind and in front of the screen, and really telling stories that really speak to, in various ways. These are all 4 different films, the Black queer experience.
In a similar sort of vein, I just wanted to highlight some poetry collections that have some that have spoken to me throughout the years, some that are newer, by Black, queer, and trans writers. I think that if you, again, something else I would recommend doing just for yourself in your free time, if you can't find a way also to use those in your classes. But I think that these texts that I have listed here, June Jordan's Directed by Desire, Audre Lorde's The Black Unicorn, Jericho Brown's The New Testament, Dinesh Smith's book Homie, Alexandria Phillips' book Whole, and Camward Awkward Rich's book Dispatch. I think that if you can find ways to incorporate even 1 or 2 poems from these books in your classes, poems are one of those small things that I think that you can share once a week, right? And to just have students think about that. I also think, going back to our conversation around what counts as scholarship, right? Typically, unless you're in an English class, a literature class that's focusing on poetry, we might not think to bring poetry into our sociology classes. We might not think to bring poetry into certainly our biology classes. So I think if you engage with poetry in any sort of way, you will find that there are so many different connections. Poets do so many fantastic, magical things with language that I feel I know poems, and I know poems in these books that could be seamlessly incorporated into a biology class. I don't know a lot about biology, but I know poems that could fit into those spaces, and that look different than what we're traditionally used to calling curriculum, biology curriculum, sociology curriculum. Poetry can enter those spaces, film can enter those spaces.
And then especially for poems, like even if you're meeting virtual and synchronously, like, you're meeting, in real time, you could start your class by, reading one of these poems, or close the class with reading a poem, just as students are entering the virtual space. And even if they don't even have to do it, biology, just beginning at that, I know some folks are, have been playing around with, music, and having music, playing while students are entering the virtual classroom. So even just, reading some poetry is also great too. And music is great too.
So here's Instagram, finally. I know we've been talking about it throughout the presentation. I really enjoy Instagram. And I think our students have really been enjoying it when we've incorporated it into the classes. what we see sort of happening within the past few months, and there's an incredible, there's actually two, I think, and possibly more incredible articles and sort of short studies of the Instagram slideshow. And we've seen that sort of pop up more so in the last couple of months on Instagram. For those of you who use Instagram, I'm sure you've encountered an Instagram slideshow that is informative in some way or another. And so these have been really useful. And I prior to this moment, or prior to preparing for the upcoming semester, we hadn't been using Instagram in this exact way. We've always used it in our classes in different ways, but what I'm using Instagram for now is to share information, to convey important topics to students. Our power just came back on. But to convey to students, to convey to them certain topics that I think would be beneficial for them and that they can get in this sort of short snippet of social media content on a platform that most of them are already familiar with. I would say just a quick tip on using Instagram that I've been sort of more mindful of is being at least aware of the other content posted by the page that you're sharing from. A lot of these sites, and some that we'll talk about a little bit later, are designated pages for informative slideshows, social justice slideshows. Some of them are people's personal but public Instagram pages. And so just being mindful, if you're sharing an Instagram page with students, just being mindful of the other content. And if you need to, say something like, I don't know, like, this is the post that I'm sharing with you, I'm not sharing the entire page with you. That's a tip that I would have.
So we wanted to highlight here with looking at Instagram is 3 Instagram pages that emerged that we've recently seen in the last few months out of UConn, and these are we don't know who runs these accounts, but we do, but we have been following them and reading their stories, and that's LGBT at UConn, Black at UConn, and UConn Survive. And we just, included just like one snippet, like one little post from each one. But if you really want to know how LGBTQ students and Black students and other students of color and survivors and some of their experiences are on your campus, your university may have had these pages pop up as well. And I think it's interesting to note that these 3 pages both have come up all around the same time. That really just speaks to the intersections of all of these different communities and issues. On the Black at UConn page, there's a lot of talk about BIPOC survivors, and on the LGBT at UConn page, there's a lot of talk about sexual harassment. They all are blending into one another, which made rise for all 3 of these pages to form. And for the UConn Survive, you can see that they all begin with a trigger warning, and then detailed below is why that there is this warning. And so we didn't share any, specific anything there, but you could check for sure to follow these pages and check them out, or again, see if your university has one. And then the 2 above, the first one is from Black at UConn, and the other one is LGBT at UConn, and you could take a second to read those.
Yeah, I think with these pages, they were all started about 8 weeks ago. So about 2 months ago, all of these pages sort of sprung up, and you can see sort of in the screenshots the number of followers and posts that they have. And one of the posts that we shared here from Black at UConn really stood out to the both of us, which is why we've included it here, but it's addressing how the student feels about going to faculty. And I think that it resonated with us, particularly regarding this presentation, because what we're trying to do by making, again, our classes anti-racist and inclusive is so students don't have to feel that way about confiding in us or looking to faculty for support, particularly in this case regarding anti-racist behavior or language, or not anti-racist, or regarding racist language or behavior. And so And I think, yeah, if you can find, if students at your school have started Instagram or other social media pages like this, it's been really, nothing has been shocking, I'll say, but it has definitely been illuminating to think about and hear about students' experiences in a way that is very open, very vulnerable, and just, again, just amazing. They want this space.
Hi, folks. I think that we are just experiencing some very brief technical difficulties, but Lauren and Mick should be back on in just a second, and we'll be excited to begin working through our Q&A segment of this presentation. So if everyone can just hold tight for 1 or 2 minutes, I see that there's a ton of engagement in the Q&A, and we've been sifting through them, and I know Gwen's excited to come back and work with Lauren and Mick on them, and oh, you're back.
Sorry about that. We're still using my phone, but we are back. Sorry.
And we just got to see the time, so we'll just quickly breeze through these last few slides. These are just some online resources that might be useful for you. Wakelet is a really cool collaborative platform where students can curate research and create newsletters. It's a really awesome platform, and I use it in my classes. I've created, and I think these links in the slideshow will be shared, but I've created a resource guide on Wakelet for understanding, identifying, confronting, disrupting, and dismantling white supremacy. And it has maybe like 60 sources on there that might be useful for folks. Do you want to talk about that?
Something else I've been using in my film class, in any course, but specifically in the spring when I was teaching women, gender, and film, and we went online, is figuring out a way we could still collectively watch a film while being physically distant. And when films were on Netflix, we were able to use Netflix Party. And if you haven't used it, whether in your classes or just with friends or family during this time, it's really fun and great to watch a film separate, physically distant and on your own computers. But you're able actually to use a chat feature. So you can also, be typing and for students, clarifying anything from the films, which is something that you actually don't get to do in person during a film. Obviously, most students don't blurt out things, and you don't blurt out things. So it was actually really great. And to use Netflix Party, when the films are available, to, watch conversations while the film is going on while still watching.
If you want to turn that off, yeah. And then lastly here, we just have Canva, which is we're back on the computer. So we have, the last thing here is Canva, which is a graphic design website, and you can have students create so many cool different things using Canva. So I recommend exploring that. We have this list of further resources, but in interest of time, I know as we came back in, Elizabeth was saying that there's a lot of engagement in the Q&A. So here's a lot of different resources, some Instagram page, some organizational work, some research that might be useful for you in getting started. And these are sort of our last 6 tips that might be useful for you as you're getting back to teaching, and as you're thinking about incorporating an anti-racist and creating an anti-racist and inclusive classroom.
And I think number one for us is then and always and forever to practice compassion, empathy, vulnerability, be flexible and adaptable. All the time. If you weren't already, please do so now. And I think that with those things, it'll create really important spaces and where students can really learn and thrive and feel comfortable with you. And their classmates, and if everyone did this, we'd have education system that is rooted in these things more often.
You should remember that both the students and you have full lives outside of the classroom. It's so easy, for us at least, it's so easy to get wrapped into working so often and trying to create the best classes. Then also sometimes being like, why don't students want to work harder in my class? It's well, students have full lives outside of the classroom, and that's okay. And we also have to remember that we have full lives that we need to tend to outside of the classroom too. So making space for you to take care of yourself, making space for students to take care of themselves. Something that I do is in between units, I just have a day where students can just rest and do some sort of reflective activity that's related to the class, but that is not, particularly for the violence class, that's not so heavy. So just, again, whatever that looks like for you in your class, just making space for that. I think it's important to collaborate with other anti-racist and inclusive educators to bounce ideas off of each other. Lauren and I have one another, which is really wonderful. And there are lots of different social media pages, particularly on Facebook, that have been really useful for us in the past couple of months as we've designed our courses. And then lastly, I would say just to consistently acknowledge the reality of the world, as we've been sort of talking about throughout. The world is not the world, or the US, the world is not the world that it was 5 months ago. And I think that acknowledging that is just a place to start. Yeah. We just wanted to close with this quote from Bettina Love, the author of We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of, I can't remember the last part, and it's blocked. It's a book on abolitionist teaching, and it's really powerful. But Bettina Love writes, too often we think the work of fighting oppression is just intellectual. The real work is personal, emotional, spiritual, and communal. It is explicit with a deep and intense understanding that loving Blackness is an act of political resistance. So as you all prepare and get ready to it's part of our spirit, and therefore we have to tend to it in a different way. Thank you. And so I think we're ready to take questions. Because we were on the phone, we weren't able to engage as much with the Q&A as we would have wanted to, but we're really excited to see what folks have had to say and to chat a little bit.
So thank you, Mick and Lauren. This has been a great presentation. There's been a lot of conversation, and folks from the Gulf are reminding us that they too have lost power. So hang in there. Wow. So you have a challenge. There are at least 6 questions I'm going to be asking you, and you have 8 minutes.
Okay.
So I will start with a question from Adam Ferguson. Adam writes, as a gay person in the classroom, it is difficult not to feel on the defensive when queer antagonist statements are made in the classroom. What has worked for you in your personal experience?
Yeah, it depends on who you are and what other identities you hold. But for me, I think in the spaces that we were in, sometimes it was easy, or it was not easy to address head on. I think as a student, my response would be to, depending, it's just, there's so many things that it depends on, but maybe talking to the instructor. If you have a teaching assistant, maybe communicating with them.
Yeah, and if it's coming, from other students, I hope that that's at a point where, an instructor, would intervene and, call out and make that a teachable moment about that language or anything like that. And if the instructor is not doing it, then hopefully that, somebody who's not queer is, an ally in the classroom, queer ally that, can take the burden away from you to do that, and they can speak up and say, and challenge that and why that's wrong or offensive. Hopefully you'll have an instructor that can do that for you and other queer students. But if not, then hopefully you have a peer in the classroom that can take some of that burden off of you.
And if it's coming from the instructor or instructors, I would and the judicial sort of logistics of universities are imperfect, to say the least. But I would try to figure out your university, what does that look like to go further, to take and even if it's students or instructors, who can you reach out to in various cultural centers or diversity department, right? Like the diversity and equity and inclusion sort of departments or centers at your school. Yeah, I think that's where I would start.
Okay. Jamira Young asks, how do you address folks who say Black Lives Matter or talk about creating an anti-racist environment in the classroom, but have not examined their personal racism and inherently cause more harm?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This work is, like we said, and like Bettina Love said, it's personal, it's emotional, it's spiritual. It only works if or not, it only, and I don't know what, for those folks, I think that my go-to would be further, I mean, if they were a person who I felt like I could have a conversation with, further conversation, further interrogation. There's always work to be done on ourselves and as we're growing and learning. So yeah, I mean, I feel so much of it depends on who the person is. So much of it depends on who the person is. But I would say do the work. If you want to do the work, do the work. People are dying, and so like, if you want to do the work, do the work. I feel like that's what I would say.
So I think related to that is a question from Tegra, and Tegra asks, thinking about the logos and the icons that you talked about, people might embed. Do you require any type of training or knowledge or practice testing before folks post these icons or put this information on their syllabus? I imagine more people want to put these logos on without doing the work. So this gets back to what you were just saying of learning how to be more inclusive among these communities.
I mean, I would definitely say that that's, step one of many. And I definitely think that a lot of folks can really use that, as, a performance sort of thing, like, oh, did that so easy and quick. And the truth is that, there's really no way of knowing on a student's end, if you may see that, you may be, in for a big surprise, and the class is actually, still super queer, antagonistic and trans antagonistic and racist, and that's not okay. But I'm hoping that by using some of those things that if you're really committed, then you might use those things more often than folks that are harmful to their students in the classroom in that way.
But we don't have any sort of like test or measure, or there's no sort of anyone can have access to these logos, at least at UConn, right? They're just on our brand website, so you can just copy and paste them right there. But I think that question about that is really an important one, something to think about. How else do you, and I think that part of answering that at least is like, or for me, like if I were a student, like how else is this instructor showing up besides their logo right at the top? What else is included in the syllabus?
I am so sad to have to cut this Q&A session short, just because we are right at time, but Lauren and Mick, thank you. You, despite power issues, despite internet issues, the ultimate professionals, an incredible session, really just rich information. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Gwen Kay, for convening and facilitating this conversation. Really, really deeply appreciative to have you here and to have Faculty Senate live tweeting for the most part over the course of SUNY Spectrum. Thank you to everyone who came, and we do hope to see everyone at our 5:30 session today. And with that, I'm going to close this session. Thank you all so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.